Welcome everybody to the DOCTalks presentation, which will feature Research Impact Canada universities, some of the researchers at our universities who are all working on how documentary film might be involved with knowledge mobilization. So just to start, I can introduce myself. My name is David Phipps. I'm a settler. I'm born to white parents in England, and we moved to this land that some people call Canada when I was 2 years old. I live in Toronto with my husband, and that's on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. And the current treaty holders are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. These are the territories where I find myself on today for this webinar. I do encourage you to take a moment to think about the traditional territories that you find yourselves on. So knowledge mobilization is how we think about creating social benefits from our scholarly and our creative activities. We know that research and teaching that is engaged with communities helps to close the loop between scholarly production and its influence on broader society. Underrepresented in knowledge mobilization practice, however, is the use of arts to help close that loop between the scholarship that we produce and how it is used in broader society. While used less than other methods of knowledge mobilization, arts-based methods use the arts to not only communicate about the research that has been done, but it also creates an emotional connection between the research and its potential benefit in broader society. So with a show of hands, raise your hand if you've, or raise your virtual hand or your thumb up if you've actually heard of Dance Your PhD. Anyone heard of Dance Your PhD? And unfortunately, I can't actually see you all. So if you haven't heard of Dance Your PhD, it's an annual competition where researchers and graduate students who are working on the PhD interpret their thesis through dance. And that's an example of arts-based knowledge mobilization. Well, documentary film, as we're talking about today, is part of an art form, and that is part of knowledge mobilization. The panels and the facilitators will take you on this journey. And we want to thank the organizers for this, the Research Impact Canada staff. We want to thank all of the researchers and other contributors to this event, and thank the audience, and thank DOCTalks as well. And happy anniversary to their 10th anniversary. Unfortunately, I do have to leave as I have elder care responsibilities this afternoon, but I'm going to leave you in the expert hands of the facilitators and the panelists. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David, for this introduction. My name is Imane Khozam. I am a bilingual knowledge mobilization specialist at Research Impact Canada, and I'll be co-facilitating today's panel discussion. So, bienvenue tout le monde. Joining me will be my wonderful colleague, Kim. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Imane. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Kim Knight, and I am a bilingual evaluation and research analysis here at Research Impact Canada. And we're looking forward to co-facilitating together this wonderful panel. Back to you, Imane.
Thank you. So before starting with the panel discussion today, just some quick housekeeping items to cover. So as you know, the simultaneous interpretation today, the French interpretation, is provided by Caroline and Cressida in the French channel. So please feel free to click on the interpretation button with the globe icon if you'd like to listen in French. Also, there's closed captioning that has also been enabled for English subtitles. So you can press on the live transcript button to access this. And we know that you will definitely have a lot of questions to ask for this webinar, so please feel free to share it in the chat box. There may be some time at the end of the panel discussion for these questions. Otherwise, we will make sure to pass them on to the panelists and later on connect with you if possible. The webinar, as you can see, is recorded and it will be available on Research Impact Canada's DOCTalks website afterwards. We will definitely inform you whenever the video is later on the websites. So without further ado, I'm going to start with introducing two of our panelists today. We have four. The first panelist I would like to introduce is Prem Sooriyakumar, who is a knowledge broker at Concordia University in Montréal. The documentary that he will be presenting today is entitled Past, Future, Forward, and it's about the making of the first Indigenous Hawaiian video game. So very interesting. Our next, so welcome, Prem. Sorry, if you can just unmute yourself, just to see. Hi.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
The other panelist who will be joining us today is Adrian Burke, who is an archaeologist and professor in the Department of Anthropology at Université de Montréal, Université de Montréal. And the documentary film he will be talking about today is called De vieilles histoires à raconter le long de la Saint-François. It recounts 4 stories that are based on 10 years of archaeological research along the St. Francis River. Passing it on to you, Kim, to introduce our other panelists.
Thank you, Imane. So today we also have the pleasure of welcoming Victoria Burns, professor at the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. She is also the producer, writer, and director of today's documentary, Beyond Housing, Finding Home After Homelessness. We also, joining her will be Amrit Matharoo, youth programming team lead at Trellis Society, and who is the co-researcher of today's documentary. Their documentary film, Beyond Housing, Finding Home After Homelessness, shines light on older homeless people who are rapidly rising in number, yet remain largely misunderstood and invisible. Welcome to you both, Victoria and Amrit. And last but not least, we welcome Julia Creet, professor at the Department of English at York University and director of the Dating Mining the Deceased, an essay documentary that explores the industry behind the exponential intensity of genealogy. Welcome, Julia. Great. And so now we will go ahead and get started. We will first turn it over to Victoria and Amrit to speak about their documentary.
Great, thank you for the warm introduction. Everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we're hearing you very
Amrit's
well.
going to be sharing the slides. I'm going to start with a territorial acknowledgement. So I live, work, and play in Calgary, Alberta, with my husband, Amrit, and you may notice my small dog behind me here on the couch or on his chair. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in region of Southern Alberta, which includes Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nation, and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. The University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River. The traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mokinsits. So I will mention I'm actually originally from the East Coast in New Brunswick and lived in Montreal for 11 years, which is where I started my program of research looking at marginalized older adults' experiences residing in low-income housing and experiencing homelessness as a result of gentrification in Montreal neighborhoods. So this has evolved over the years into a program of research looking at arts-based methods, including documentary film. But for today, I'm going to focus specifically on the film Beyond Housing and provide a little bit of an overview of our methodological lens, so community-based participatory research. And then Amrit's going to take over. So Amrit was a very talented research assistant on the project. And developed some relationships, close relationships with the 7 older adults who were actually co-researchers on the project. And she's going to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities of using documentary film with older adults from the research perspective, the older adults perspective, and then her own perspective. And for those of you who might be interested in learning more about our methodology and the study, you can check out this study published in the Journal of Social Work Education that is just posted there. All right, so this film actually was funded, the research project was funded by SSHRC, so the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and we had a modest budget, and the original plan was actually to do photo voice with the older adults. And what we were doing is looking at doing some in-depth examination of their experiences of exiting homelessness, because a lot of their research had been focused on pathways into homelessness and then the experiences during homelessness. So what we were really interested in is what happens when people transition and kind of find some stability. What does that look like? Where are they living? And we wanted to document that, the types of housing, and we were looking at it through the lens of home, the theoretical framework of home. And this involved looking at their everyday journeys. So from the moment they woke up till the moment they went to bed, what was that like for them? Where did they go? Were they staying within their housing? And we wanted to show that also the diversity of older homelessness, because there tends to be this idea of homelessness as being one thing. And often it's the street homeless person, which has been covered extensively in media. And that is actually a very small proportion of older adults or any homelessness. The quote unquote chronic street homeless person only account for about 6% of the total homeless population, which includes the invisible. So we wanted to highlight that as well. So we embarked on this using visual methods and specifically pink and rose. And we shifted from photo voice. So when we were doing these everyday journeys, we gave older adults these cameras, little an actual camera to take photos of their everyday journeys. And they found that it was difficult for them. They didn't quite understand what was happening or the purpose. And then we thought, you know what? Started looking at the literature around documentary filmmaking and the ethnographic tradition, and applied for a grant through Story Hive to get an extra $10,000 to hire a community-minded filmmaker. And that led us into creating this documentary film. There is a shift from the participant, the older adult as participant, to co-researchers. So they were involved in every step of the way, the editing, kind of deciding, leading us on their everyday journeys. Next slide, please. Okay, so we ended up interviewing or working with as co-researchers over about 2 years, 7 Calgarians, so 4 who identified as women and 3 males. They had diverse identities and homeless histories. And then the aim was to raise awareness about older homelessness and provide a voice through the research question, what helps and hinders feeling at home? So this first box art is Hillary and George. Unfortunately, George is no longer with us. So we started off with a 10-minute short, and we highlighted their 2 stories, and also through looking at the city of Calgary and what their experiences of homelessness and finding home looked like. And then we did a 30-minute version highlighting 7 diverse stories of older homelessness. And that's the second box art. And this one was called We're Not Ready for the Shelf. And Amrit will talk a little bit about that, what that means. Next slide, please. I'm just going to show a 2-minute clip of the start of the short version.
You'll just have to let me know if the sound is working. I believe it should.
Are we rolling? I became homeless. I don't know the exact date, probably about 2012 to 2015, but I had kind of breaks in between. I was part of the hidden homeless in Edmonton, but I had an apartment building which I didn't realize at the time was in a really bad area of Edmonton, and it was infested with bed bugs, and everything I had I kind of lost, had to throw it out. I kept on getting woken up in the middle of the night because I was on the basement floor and I didn't have drapes at the time, and there was some not nice people running around, kept on banging on my door and waking me up because I had to sleep in the living room.
Yeah, I became homeless. I can't recollect as to what year it is, but it was only a year and a half after coming to this country. So I was on the streets, and I landed up at it's called the Salvation Army, and they were at a smaller facility than what is today. That was not built. This was the anchorage.
What makes you feel included in Calgary? These are the 4 things, but also like going out and seeing people who know you. Okay. Right? Like you've all talked about that, or within your community itself. And that's why I think we need to think about what community actually means. Because I know Peter Coyle is like a micro kind of community, right? I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit about how it is a community in its own right. And like, do you feel like you need to go out to get your needs met, or do you have everything on site?
My needs or my wants?
Good question.
Right on.
Touche.
Being homeless was pretty bad. It just sort of sprang on me. I didn't anticipate it at all. So therefore I wasn't prepared for it. It was quite the shock to the system, because I always said to myself, it doesn't matter how bad things get, just so long as you find yourself a job, you pull up your socks and keep going.
Okay, so those were just some small clips of kind of the longer 10-minute and 30-minute documentaries, which are available for people to watch on YouTube if they would like to watch the full length. But this documentary, and from a student researcher perspective, brought a lot of things to the forefront. Linda, who is in this picture and who you saw talking in the last clip there, mentioned something about not being ready for the shelf, which really became kind of like the headliner for the full length documentary. It was really this sense of purpose that the older adults felt that they got with the documentary itself, and being a co-researcher in that, but also everything that came with the documentary, being able to talk at film festivals, being able to use the documentary as a medium for community building and advocacy in their own lives and in their own right, and really feeling like, we have something to still offer the world, and that we're not ready to be pushed aside and thought of as passive service users, and that we have lots to add and lots of things that we can bring to an understanding of homelessness, older homelessness, and just community advocacy in general, which was an amazing thing to witness and be a part of. And so, yeah, Linda was kind enough to let us use her quote as the kind of headliner for the full length documentary. Moving on, I think one of the things that was very apparent with this type of filmmaking, this type of documentary filmmaking, was that it became very personal. That these researchers were not only co-researchers, but many of them became friends with each other. And as a student researcher, I built some very, very strong relationships with several of the co-researchers. And that was amazing. I think it also lent to some challenges that we had to navigate. There was a lot of interpersonal kind of mediation that had to take place. Like Victoria had mentioned, we had lost George at some point during the research, which was really difficult for everybody. One of the other researchers, Anne, had made this beautiful drawing for George, and we had at least an opportunity to honor his life and what he brought to even just this project, but everything else that he had done as well. There was a lot of mediating group dynamics, certain co-researchers feeling that they were feeling left out at certain points, and really wanting to meet the needs of the project and deliver those and answer the research questions while ensuring there was this equitable airtime, making sure that each co-researcher felt that their story was being heard in a really valuable and intentional way. For 7 adults, 30 minutes is probably not long enough to talk about their lives and everything that they've experienced and everything that they have to continue to add. So those were some of the challenges that came about from the documentary filmmaking process. And I'll pass it over to Victoria to talk a little bit about the research perspective.
Yeah, we've got 1 minute left, so just going to wrap this up. I think this is important though, because this is atypical in terms of, receiving ethics. So we did receive a little bit of pushback, but through explaining to our ethics officers, we were able to push things through, specifically around this notion of vulnerability, right? And needing to protect folks and their identities. And these were folks who wanted to share their stories, right? So I think we need to kind of critically question, we wanted to pass the mic, right? We didn't want these people to be invisible. And that was what was the power of this methodology. Just the logistics, trying to get folks with disabilities included in this kind of work it takes extra effort and work. Mental health issues. Sometimes we'd show up for a shoot and someone just wouldn't show up or would be, ill. And these are things that you have to think about, and why I think people with disabilities, we need to kind of ensure that it does take extra work, but it's really important. And then the power dynamics and democratizing participation. Next slide.
Yeah, and then just finally wrapping up kind of the student perspective. There was a lot of navigating boundaries. How much can I be a friend to these older adults versus a professional and a social worker while also being a researcher? So really trying to navigate those and using the help of Victoria and the other professors on the project. And then really kind of carving out how do we make spaces for emerging social workers to be a researcher while also staying connected to the practice and creating space for both, because oftentimes it feels like a spectrum where you choose one or the other. So we will wrap our presentation up there. If you have questions, please reach out to Victoria. And again, the documentary is available on YouTube for people to watch if they would like to.
Amrit and Victoria, thank you so much for this very wonderful and insightful presentation, and it really just presents the reality in its raw form. So a lot to learn from you two. And I'm sure we will be very excited to hear more about the documentary and see it. If you can share also the link to the YouTube in the chat box. Moving on today now with Adrian Burke to talk more about the documentary has been involved in. Adrian, welcome. The floor is yours.
Oui, bonjour, salut tout le monde. Very happy to be here. I am in the area of the lower Ottawa River, and as I put in the discussion, it's actually the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Kanien'kehá:ka, because I literally live right in front of Kanesatake, which is the community next to Oka that you might have heard about. But this documentary actually takes place on the traditional territory of the Abenaki Nation, and which is just east of Montreal. So the documentary is a 38-minute documentary. It covers 10,000 years of archaeology and Indigenous history in a region of Quebec called the Eastern Townships, or Estrie, which is in the southeast of the province, sort of on the border with Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. And this is the traditional territory of the Abenaki Nation. So the Abenaki call the territory the Indakina. The St. Francis River, or Alsigontekuk, which is the Abenaki name, it runs through this very beautiful region. It's a very major river, big river, and it's always been at the center of the life and the culture and the worldview also of the Abenaki. The documentary itself is actually the result of a close collaboration between a filmmaker on one hand, Bruno Fraser, and an archaeologist, my colleague, Claude Chapdelaine. What was the point of making the documentary? Well, initially the idea was to present the results of 10 years of archaeological research in one region of Quebec by a multidisciplinary team of researchers. archaeology is a field of research that requires a collaboration of many different specialists. So whether it's to identify plant pollen to reconstruct the past environment, or to understand how the soil of a site might change or evolve, or to look at, you know, the animal remains that you find on a site to understand what people ate in the past, for example. So the documentary actually has 11 different university researchers that present their contributions to reconstructing the long-term human history of this region of what is referred to as Wabanagyak, which is the Dawn Land. There are 2 Indigenous collaborators as well who present in the film at the beginning, and they are 2 members of the Abenaki Nation who are responsible for overseeing archaeology and other research actually for the Abenaki Nation. And they also provide their perspective on what archaeology contribute to the aspirations and the projects of the Abenaki Nation. I think it's also important to note, and you know, this is a reason for making the documentary, is that archaeologists actually have an ethical obligation. It's our professional obligation, an ethical obligation, to share the knowledge that is produced from, for example, archaeological digs, because archaeological heritage actually belongs to everyone, right? It's the archaeological heritage that what's in the ground it literally belongs to the public, to citizens, and citizens, of course, pay for pretty much all of the research as well. Now, I guess one of the interesting questions was, you know, why use filmmaking? I guess archaeologists actually use many different methods to reach the public at large and to share our knowledge and discoveries. So we're not necessarily just all the time in the lab or in the field by ourselves. We actually consider it to be a pretty important part of our job to transfer knowledge or mobilize knowledge. You know, we give public talks all the time, and we have excavations where the public can participate. For example, every province and territory in Canada and every state in the United States has an archaeology month where the public participates directly in archaeological discovery. In Quebec, for example, the month of August is dedicated entirely to this. And it basically brings the public and the archaeologists together, and there's hundreds of activities, and people can you know, excavate for the day or spend the day in a museum looking at artifacts, for example. So we already use a lot of different means to try and reach the public and to mobilize this knowledge, which of course in large part is held in museums and university departments and in collections that are often not accessible to the public, and is published of course in journals that are often not really read by the public. So now a documentary film just seemed like a logical addition to what we do in terms of trying to share our knowledge. And especially because it seems like there weren't many documentaries on archaeology in Canada. I think that many of you have probably seen shows on archaeology on maybe Discovery and History Channel, but to be polite, these tend to be a bit sensationalist. I myself have even had to contribute as a sort of expert in some of these documentaries. I try not to do it anymore. There's shows like The Nature of Things, of course, that often present archaeological subjects, but I'd say that rarely the archaeologists actually get to talk about the archaeology in their own words. It's usually kind of broken up, and there's never enough room to really talk about in detail about the work that we do, especially in short TV shows that are 30 minutes long, for example. So I'd say that, you know, for us, you know, for archaeologists, obviously archaeology is very exciting. It's, you know, it's a passion, but it's not because, you know, it's like Indiana Jones, obviously. It's more because every day, literally every day that we're doing archaeology, there's a possibility of new discoveries and especially things that can inform us on our collective human past. So for us, it is exciting, but understandably, making a film about something like excavation that can sometimes be pretty slow and tedious, that's where, you know, I guess the trick comes in, to make it actually interesting to the public, while not being, say, sensationalist, perhaps like Discovery Channel might do. in terms of the impacts of the documentary, well, there's sort of two parts to this. The initial idea was just to get more people to know about the work that we do, that archaeologists do, and especially all the other allied scientific disciplines that we work with, and that we all work together in terms of protecting the past, the collective past, our heritage. So what we did is we started by organizing some screenings in the region where we were working, in this region of Quebec, in person and online. Obviously, COVID came, and that kind of threw a wrench in the works, or kind of messed up our plans. But we did start by presenting the documentary first to the Abenaki Nation to see what their feelings were about it, and then to see if they were okay with us going forward with, the public presentations. Then we did a couple of public presentations also online for Archaeology Month, and that went pretty well. I mean, our idea is, of course, to make the film available online for free. The filmmaker wants to just do some final tweaks, and then he'll put it on his website with basically a link to YouTube, I guess, or Vimeo, or some other support. So in that case, the documentary will be available. But that was sort of the first step, and after going through a couple of those online screenings and talks, I realized that there was something missing in a way. I felt like there wasn't we weren't really showcasing or using the documentary well enough, or to its full extent, what we would say in French, mise en valeur. So we got, what I did is I actually applied for a small grant that's actually a knowledge mobilization grant to organize public screenings. But in this case, the idea was to bring together the archaeologist, the filmmaker, the public, but also members of the Abenaki Nation, and to try and look at, what people, citizens, let's say, of Quebec, and specifically that area of Quebec, feel about archaeology and what the role of archaeology is in today's society. And I indirectly, what I wanted to do was to see if the film could spark a discussion about Indigenous nations in Quebec and their place in contemporary Quebec. So, like I said, COVID kind of got in the way, but in the few screenings that we've done, it's been primarily Euro-Canadian, Euro-Quebecois citizens, and we've had. In one case, we had members of the Abenaki Nation present, but there didn't seem to be an awful lot of dialogue. So what we're going to try and do in the coming months is maybe change the format of the screenings, of the public screenings. We're going to do one screening next month, probably in the Abenaki community again, and see how that goes. The Abenaki Nation obviously is a major stakeholder, since most of the archaeology of this documentary concerns their past. So, but my idea is also eventually, through another grant, is to actually create a separate documentary. In other words, another documentary, its twin, if you will, that focuses essentially only on their perspective on archaeology and the findings in this region. And then maybe what would be more fun would be to present both documentaries together and then have a real discussion in the room. In terms of making the film, I have to say I was just a bit player. I learned a lot from participating, and especially what goes into the filmmaking process. I was personally more interested in seeing how the public would react, and to initiate this discussion, like I said, about the role of archaeology in today's society. Is archaeology necessary or useful? Who gets to interpret the past? I'd say that, right now, obviously, we can talk more about this, but I think that in terms of knowledge mobilization, we need to constantly find new ways to get the knowledge that we create in university settings, at least, out there to the public, to the communities of practitioners, for example, and to the people who pay for the research, and to descendant communities, in this case, for example, the Abenaki Nation, that are very directly concerned with our research findings. So what I found is that, of course, there's so many creative people that can help us. And I think that there's no limit really to the creativity of the artist and the researchers. And, in archaeology, we have seen some really good graphic novels lately as well. I've participated in podcasts. I can think of at least 3 regular podcasts on archaeology. So I think that there's many ways of getting this information across. And the documentary was one way that seemed like a logical thing to do. So I think I'll stop there. I'm not sure if I think I took about 10 minutes, but I think that maybe we'll leave a little bit more time for questions. So.
Thank you so much, Adrian. This was a great presentation. You said something that really struck a chord, which is archaeological heritage belongs to everyone. And like using the documentary as a medium to facilitate that mission is really impressive. And I'm sure there's a lot to further learn on that subject. It would be great later on also to see the movie once the filmmaker will post it on social media. Moving on now to Prem, if you'd like to introduce the documentary you've been working on. The floor is yours, Prem.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here. And then I think we did some tests where I'll switch back and forth to be able to play you some clips from the documentary. Well, thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank DOCTalks and Research Impact Canada for having me on the panel today. And I'm really looking forward to kind of unpacking the process and reflections on making this film, Past, Future, Forward, the making of a Hawaiian video game. I co-directed this documentary with Professor Jason Edward Lewis, who is based at Concordia University, Department of Design and Computation Arts, and is also a Concordia University Research Chair in Computational Media and the Indigenous Future Imaginary. A little bit more about myself. As you know, I'm a knowledge broker, so I've been on the other side of when research gets produced. I either come in throughout the process, but look at how to create accessibility or have impact. And the one thing you should know, I've been at Concordia for 10 years, but before that, I used to be in the documentary and television industry as a director or a film editor. So in a way, a lot of how I approached knowledge mobilization has been as a filmmaker. And one of the reasons I started at Concordia was because I felt like I wanted to be directly at the source of the knowledge production and to be able to produce content that reflected it versus what I was doing in the industry, which became more about entertainment. And so this is the film and the poster that was created where we used actual imagery from the participants that created from the workshop. So I think one of the contexts I want to get into before I dive into the film is that this film is about the 5th iteration of the Skins video game workshop, which was developed by ABTEC, Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, which is a research creation network with the goal of ensuring Indigenous presence in cyberspace, such as web pages, video games, and virtual worlds. It was founded by Professor Jason Lewis and artist Skawanati. I'd like to express my gratitude for being invited to collaborate on making this film about their work, as this project specifically has helped me develop as a filmmaker in the knowledge mobilization space. So focusing on the actual workshops, the workshop itself is developed to focus on traditional storytelling, exploring legends, histories, and dreams of the communities, and proceeds to transform to tell a story in a new way as a video game. They have been developing this workshop since 2006. The first one was in 2008, and I got my start actually editing the first documentation video for the first workshop, and then made a small film about the second workshop, which was purely focused on the kind of methodology and the actual details about the workshop. So this workshop that the film is based on was initiated when Kamehameha schools in Hawaii approached ABTEC. They would be interested in mounting similar workshop in Honolulu. And ABTEC developed this workshop via the Initiative for Indigenous Futures Partnership Grant. And just a quick note, Kamehameha School was developed by Princess Bernice Pau'i Bishop to educate children of Hawaiian descent and is designed to serve students from preschool through 12th grade. The school teaches in the English language as a college prep education enhanced by Hawaiian culture, language, and practices, imparting historical and practical value of continuing Hawaiian traditions. It operates 31 schools statewide and 3 grade K-12 campuses. And just to get more details, because I think one of the goals is when you make such a film or object is to also get more interest in the actual research initiatives. So the Initiative for Indigenous Futures is a partnership of universities and community organizations dedicated to developing multiple visions of Indigenous peoples tomorrow in order to better understand where they need to go today. Though through its 4 main components, workshops, residencies, symposia, and archive, Institute for Indigenous Futures will encourage, enable artists, academic, youth, and elders to imagine how they and their communities will look in the future. IFF is conducted by the Aboriginal territories in cyberspace. So let's get to the workshop. So this 5th iteration of the workshop took place 17th of July to 4th of August in 2017. It was I documented a kind of a 3-week intensive process. And what I'm going to do next, instead of just talking about the context of it, I'm going to show you a clip from the film. Is it still stuttering?
I really enjoyed the storytelling and the opening we did at Papahana Kuaola. I think it was really a necessary step to kind of connect a lot of the people that were going to be in the workshop. And that set the base for coming to this building, Halau Inana, developing a story as a team. He's going to be throwing, he's going to be spitting the lyrics. Okay. Okay. 1, 2, 1, 2. Aloha kākou o ka wila mai i ia, he la la hau ngā ka pā ki tika, ko kumu e whanua e ka papahe au hau, e hoi ke ka la hu hoi i o au kākou. Ka i tēnā ka wai i oina o e ka mō mana, o kupuna mākai mō hai e kau ai kākou i rana. Na leila ke ina o hoi kākou, o e ang mō ka au hau, i kōlu pēna ka kākou i ka te mana o ka au ka di kē.
Over here at Halau Inana, kind of in the middle of Mo'ili'ili, right in the middle of town, in the middle of all the concrete, and it's hot, trafficy, and all of that. When we talk about recovering our cultural practices and stuff, we always talk about getting back to the aina. So like getting our hands dirty, going into the lo'i, going to the fish pond, working in the streams. But I think what the places like Halau Inana and this workshop remind us of is that the digital realm is our aina as well. You know, it's a place that we live. It's a place that we can nurture abundance.
A little bit close fan. I grew up out in Makaha. I grew up working in the lo'i in the back of Waianae Valley. Grew up listening to like Sonic Youth and reading Burroughs and stuff like that. So kind of like a little bit fusion of Hawaii stuff. I got big into creating games. Because, you know, we didn't really have TV. I had 2 other brothers. I could make all kinds of board games. I've never been bored for decades. At the very least, that's the gift you guys are giving yourselves by launching your own canoes into and scouting into unknown territory, which is your own project, which is your own vision, which is the story that you're telling now.
We picked 15 really strong candidates. We were able to get this really good mix of folks who were grounded culture-wise. They knew Mo'olelo, they knew their Olelo, and they knew the foundational reasons why we should be doing something like this. And then we could also get people who were really very well-versed in the technical skills. And then what was even more exciting to me was that we had people who are already a combination of both.
super crazy because it worked perfectly to what I needed right now or I desired at the moment. Like the marriage of Hawaiian culture and video games.
There was a little ad on Facebook and I was like, oh, Hawaiians and video games? That's cool. And then they said there was applications happening. Like, well, I probably won't get in because I'm not a tech person, but so I applied and it asked all these questions that were so interesting. I'm like, what's the importance of storytelling and mo'olelo?
For me, I haven't been really surrounded by a lot of Hawaiian speakers before. I think that when I think about my idea of Hawaii, it's more than just like the land or just the history that's here, but also how people feel and how the way that they feel, how it influences what they do and how they think and how they move forward.
Okay, I see a note now that it was lagging. My apologies. So I wanted to give you a context because it's the initial introduction to the film. And, where I'm coming from, I think the best thing I can share about knowledge mobilization and documentary filmmaking and academic research is really get into the process of how this film was made. Because where I would start is I started with the approach of what I'm referring to as pure documentation, where I just went in, I didn't have a story, I didn't have a specific kind of goal or narrative to kind of, weed out, to figure out, to like push for. I went in with the intention of documenting, recording what I saw and heard, and respecting the research ethics that was outlined by the project. There was always an intention to making a kind of a show and tell video. But up to that point, I almost approached every aspect of experiencing this for the 3 weeks as a, archival project, so that researchers can use this material to write papers, or graduate students can look at it in the future. It could just be a resource at some point. So I could get deeper into what that specifically meant. I kind of just made a list. So every activity that was taking place, from talks, presentation, any evidence such as like whiteboards and design notes, I would capture it. And I think the reason I'm emphasizing on this, because I think it played a key role in developing a film that wasn't just a documentary film, but a documentary film that was mobilizing knowledge. So what I'm showing you here is the timeline, and this is what I stared at for a very long time as the film was coming together. So as I said, it was never intended to be a feature-length narrative film, but as I started putting it together, and especially the interviews, Jason and I started seeing a narrative emerge and started seeing a true potential where what we were able to weave from the 100 hours of footage and still photographs that came back was the idea that there was, through these interviews of the participant, hosts, and cultural advisors, there was insight and narrative that started emerging. These interviews started expressing multiple levels of cultural learning and engagement that was occurring in the workshop, but were difficult to see either in the moment or afterward. And this is what became the kind of core of the film. The film developed into a complex interplay between cultural practice, language, and the use of new technologies of communication, the generational trauma caused by American theft of Hawaiian lands, and the ways which mo'olelo stories and histories shape what it means to be Hawaiian today and what it might mean tomorrow. I think the impact lies in making the invisible visible, creating accessibility to this experience through this film. And I'm just going to quit this so you could actually see a proper clip.
open with Ehomai, which is a real common chant that asks for knowledge. It's the kind of thing we stand together in a circle, we join hands. It's a way to kind of focus our energy and bring us together and get us of the same mind. Ehomai, especially in this video game workshop, to me is a very interesting anchor point. You know, it's a reminder that yes, this is a new aina for us, this is new technology, but we're going at it grounded in our cultural values.
Weaving of the mo'olelo for the video game was a really interesting process because we had to get 15 people together to discuss what kind of story we would want to tell. And there were some of us who were like, there's this 400-page story that I love so much. And people are like, how are you going to do that in a game? You know, so early on, the question arose between people who are interested in gameplay and people who are deeply invested in values, culture, and the story, going, well, the story has to say this deep, profound thing. And then game players saying, well, how's that fun?
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was the core of the presentation. The film will be out soon. We're actually at the Hawaiian International Film Festival on November 5th, and soon will be available publicly for viewing.
Thank you so much, Prem, for sharing the work that you've done and how much this film has come along as an initiative for Indigenous futures. And now we're going to pass it over to Julia.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to talk about this, to talk about data mining the deceased, which has been out since 2017. So the reason I decided to make the documentary was that I had done a previous documentary, one of the first SSHRC-funded docs, actually, which was 38 minutes, and it was a family history. And when I finished that project in 2000, I released it in 2008, I realized that I was in the middle of a zeitgeist, that, you know, my impulse to tell the story was part of a much larger impulse. And so I became, because, you know, I'm a researcher by nature, I became very interested in the industry of family history itself, the industry of genealogy. I knew there were some big databases out there. And I wanted to explore who was collecting the information and why were they collecting it, and were the stakes of the industry the same as the stakes of the of family historians. And because it was an exponentially growing hobby and business, I knew that there would be a large viewership. I knew that I could engage a wide public if I used documentary film as the main mode of disseminating the research. So I was very fortunate. I hired a Mormon research assistant, and because the largest databases are held by the Church of the Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ, or Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. And so it was very important to be able to talk to the people who are running these databases. So there were a lot of sort of sensitive issues involved about religion, business, DNA, very high personal stakes in obtaining the information. I found 3 people who, well, a couple and then 2 other people who sort of formed the narrative arc. And we explored their stakes in the context of the larger industry motivations. So it turned out to be an hour-length broadcast quality doc. TVO bought the license for it, and it was a cheap hour for TVO because they aired it 27 times. Be careful when you go to license these things. And it's gone around the world. It got picked up by a distributor in the UK, and it's now streaming on Amazon Prime pretty much around the world. So and I've done about 30 screenings in person with discussion groups, many of them genealogical society groups. And we had an impact strategy that went with the doc. I hired an impact producer, and we sent letters to basically every library and every genealogical group in Canada, telling them about the project. It was funded through SSHRC, but also through the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, because of the privacy issues involved with genealogical information. And, the combination of family histories with DNA is one of the most potent data sets there is, particularly for pharmaceutical research. So what I found, and sort of the outcome of the doc, and were I to do an addendum now, there would be other issues, but that the largest stakeholders were the Mormon Church, and they were gathering the information, and they are still the largest, ever-growing, largest collector of aggregator of information. So they're doing it for religious purposes. Companies like Decode Genetics in Iceland, we went to Iceland because it has the most complete database anywhere. They were doing it for pharmaceutical development. And that the aftermarket or the secondary market uses of the information were almost more lucrative than the information that was being provided to family historians who were using the databases to get information about, a very intimate circle of people. So there was this strange split in some ways between the users, the consumers, and the industry itself. I'm just going to show you, I'll show you the first minute and a half of it. So you get a sense of the pacing, some of the issues, some of the experts. We got QuickTime. Are you seeing QuickTime there? Not yet. All right. Let's see what the volume looks like.
There's something in all of us, some innate need to know who we are and why we are who we are. And that leads you immediately to start looking into your past.
It's about selling relationships, and it's about making money out of the ways in which people are related to one another. We are using genetic tools to make trans-historical truth claims about ancestry and about human history.
My journey into family history began in the mid-1990s, when I was driven to discover the details of a family's secret. By the mid-2000s, after a decade of digging, I realized that this sojourn back into my own past could go on forever. And in that short time, genealogy had become an accelerating online industry and the existential stuff of reality TV. But what does knowing your ancestors really tell you about who you are? And was my enthusiasm for family history truly my own? Is the business of family history really about family? Or are we essentially data mining the deceased?
It was a fantastic project to do, but I have to say that the learning curve was incredibly steep, and producing docs on top of a full-time teaching job is a bit strenuous. But that said, I've got a third one in the works. I think in terms of intended impacts, it really did reach the audience that I hoped it would reach. Maybe not as broadly as I hoped it would, but I'm still getting requests. I mean, I did one a couple of weeks ago for, you know, the Niagara Lifelong Learning group. So, you know, I mean, I'm still, the conversation is still very much ongoing. It's a topic that could really use another documentary, because now, of course, law enforcement has used the genealogy databases to solve cold cases. And that brings with it a host of other questions about unanticipated uses of data and also privacy issues. So I would, you know, I think in terms of, as knowledge mobilization, documentary film is incredibly potent, but we're also dealing with an industry, you know, again, the doc industry, and that if you want to make something that will really travel, you have to make something, you have to produce a product that's professional enough that it could get on broadcast TV, it could be picked up by a distributor, because I think one of the problems is that you can make a documentary film, but if you're still trying to circulate it through the same kinds of avenues, and it, you know, Adrian, you talked about that problem a bit, you're going to reach the same audiences. So part of the mobilization puzzle is how to then engage with the wider industry, entertainment industry. And I think that becomes, you know, people said to me when I made the doc, well, congratulations, you've made a great doc. Now your work is only half done. The other 50% of this job is actually getting it out there. So congrats to everyone for having made a doc. Now, you know, now the challenge is to actually get it in front of people's eyeballs. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about the doc.
Julia, thank you so much. I love the personal touch that you added at the beginning of the film, where you described your own journey throughout this process. And it definitely raises a lot of questions about us wanting us to track our genealogy, but what are the additional repercussions that, you know, we're not aware of when it comes to all this data that is now available and how this data is being used. Certainly a lot of important topics to take into consideration. Now we would like to move on to some short Q&A session for our panelists to follow up on their presentations. I will move it to Kim to start her first question. Kim.
Thank you, Imane. Great. So the first question that we have is for Victoria. And the question is, with your film Beyond Housing, the storytelling method was used in the documentary. Can you explain why you chose to do this and what has been the impact of using this technique?
Yeah, so we wanted to use documentary film, storytelling through documentary film, because we wanted to make the research accessible to as many people, organizations as possible, and move beyond the peer-reviewed journal, which is very limited. And that was where most of the knowledge around older homelessness was housed, and it was very narrow in view. As I mentioned, it was really more quantitative, looking at statistics and risks and that kind of thing. So in terms of impact, I will say that the process of acquiring the funding through Trellis StoryHive, I don't know if folks are familiar with Trellis StoryHive, but they have different competitions all the time, and we had to do a 1 minute kind of like a pitch about our video, and then there's a voting system as well. So it was a steep learning curve, but there were over 6,000 votes for our film to be funded, and like 6,000 views on a peer-reviewed. Like, I don't think anything in my career has received that much attention in terms of peer, or ever will, probably. So I think it was just getting more attention and more interest. And it is the gift that keeps on giving. Honestly, we did this documentary in the SSHRC funding came in 2017. We did the film in 2017 to 2019. And we've presented it along with the older adult co-researchers at various film festivals. So there's one in Calgary, a Third Action Film Festival. I submitted it to this Tokyo Cowboys Film Festival. It got accepted. I just presented in March for the federal government employment skills development. They wanted something on older homelessness, and because of the film, you know, it's gotten attention, and a lot of people have reached out about it. And even to this day, the older adults, like, they do their own advocacy using the film as well. And that was one of the, so in terms of the impact, it definitely, using this method has been very impactful, I would say. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Moving on now to Adrian. The documentary that you talked about really highlights the role that archaeology plays in our understanding of history. And it also raises several questions related to Indigenous communities in Quebec. And you've talked in a very detailed way about that process of the filmmaking, how it happened. But can you identify some takeaways, 2 to 3 takeaways from collaborating with the filmmaker Bruno Frizer? Can you unmute?
Okay, yeah, now you can hear me. Well, I mean, the first takeaway is, of course, the other people in this panel who have already made documentary films know this, is that, wow, is it a long labor of love. And it's you know, we are in the 27th version of the documentary, and that's 27, the complete version. There's, of course, literally hundreds of hours of editing. I've only had the pleasure, or I don't know if that's even a pleasure, to work on Final Cut Pro in the past to do subtitles, and even that I found tedious. So clearly we all have our passions, and we all have our abilities to work for hours on things that we think are important. And so it was amazing to work with a professional, you know, and to see that, you know, something like archaeology that sometimes can, I mean, quite literally be like watching paint dry on a wall, you know, can be made interesting and exciting without necessarily being made sensationalist and creating some kind of weird, you know, straw man or Atlantis theory or something, and then making up some story only to find out 30 minutes later that basically, oh no, the archaeologist just found some stuff, and, you know, it wasn't really that exciting. But you know, that's how science works. It's a cumulative, you know, gathering information, learning at every step. So that was one takeaway. I mean, clearly, you know, you have to work with a professional. You have to recognize the skills of everybody involved, and artists are some of the hardest working people I know. And so it was really interesting. I think that really the only reason it worked in our case was just because he was so passionate and just really wanted to try this. He got paid almost nothing. Somebody asked a question in the Q&R. I mean, to be honest, we have a research team that I've been running, sort of the director of for 8 years, funded by the Quebec government. And I was able to put some money aside, but I mean, it will never, ever cover the hours that this person spent. I mean, hundreds of hours, quite literally, doing this. So, you know, I think that obviously some other people can talk to maybe other sources of funding for that. But I think that a university researcher who knows nothing about this needs to know first that you need to get some money so that you can properly pay the professionals that have the skills to do this. And also some of the participants. Somebody asked a question in the Q&R, and that is an interesting question as well. In our case, the participants, the researchers did not want to be paid, but there are other cases, of course, where that would be appropriate.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Like, I love the paint dry on the wall analogy. And thank you also for addressing all the participants' questions. I would also encourage the other panelists, if they felt while answering that they want to also target other questions, please feel free to do so. Moving on now to Prem, one of the participants in the video actually used a very nice word. They said like the workshop was an anchor point. And I know that equally the documentary filmmaking, the filmmaking of the video making was also similarly for you as well. You know, it was not only documenting the journey of Aboriginal Hawaiian students throughout the video game workshop, but it was also providing a space for reflecting, communicating, and connecting with different people involved in the project. So can you briefly please describe how the film making process created that space?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that wonderful question. So I think there's two parts. So we've had some test rough cut screening with the participants. I think, and I'm looking forward to showing the final version soon and getting the reaction, but those initial reactions, I think, is that all the interviews I did were individuals. So the reflections are suddenly weaved together. So their voice becomes one. And I think that really, like, the process created a unity, but hearing back and seeing what happened in a united kind of voice where the parallels were connected, I think created a lot of meaning. I think the thing that I can really talk about in terms of creating space, I think it was really important that this was a collaboration between myself and Jason, who's Indigenous Hawaiian, who's here, but the idea is that it allowed us to be an outsider and insider, and I think those two sides allowed to always allow my kind of curiosity to go in search of things, and then also creating certain boundaries and also validating the paths we were taking, and I think that's really important because I think creating the right space, it's also about being authentic and being respectful. And one example of that, one of the things we decided to do in the film, I didn't get to talk about, was we decided to not to explain Hawaiian terms. Like, it wasn't a, tell-all kind of Discovery Channel documentary, but it allows that it creates the space even for the viewer to kind of enter in as you were there.
Thank you so much, Prem. I really like the fact that you show the importance of the outsider and insider and bringing that all into the importance of community. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, we do have a question for Julia.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. And so the question, Julia, in regards to your film, can you briefly describe what the process was like to work on an investigative piece that shifts how we view the genealogy industry?
There were lots of challenges. The first actually came from the crew that I was working with, who were mostly friends in filmmakers, independent filmmakers, and they said to me, "Look, there's no story here. You want to do a documentary about databases? Could you pick a more boring topic?" So part of the problem was I knew there was a story there, but I didn't know what it was. But I just had a sense that there was something off about the public-facing pitch of the industry, and that there was something sort of pernicious behind it. So I think the investigative part of it came almost, from my suspicions about it. But at the same time, I had to recognize how deep the personal stakes were. And for me, that was a constant back and forth between, I know what this means to people, but at some level, I don't trust it. So it was intellectually, I think, the challenge of trying to contextualize my own experience. And we're much more accepting of the idea that so much of our research begins with, might begin very close to home and then sort of works outwards from there. But in this case, it was really, there were moments when I found it very confusing. And what helped, I think, was working with editors who could take this, and I was a terrible interviewer. I mean, a great interviewer, but I would go on for an hour and a half, and my editors would go, "Oh my Lord, are you out of your mind? You know, this interview should have been 20 minutes." But in that hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever, when we finally managed to you know, edit the interviews, it was the editors who were able to see what the bigger story is. So that's the other thing about documentary film. It's really difficult to do without an external editor. As a filmmaker, you need editors. So sometimes the shape of it, the investigative shape of it, comes from, again, people who were external to the actual process of collecting the data, which is unlike other academic work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia, for sharing those insights and a lot of your knowledge as well through this work. Now we do have a few minutes, and so we know that there were some questions that were shared in Q&A. So let's take a look at that. Imane, would you like to go ahead and select the question?
Oh, thank you, Kim. Well, I see that most of our panelists did answer the questions. I'm just gonna read quickly through the questions that were covered, and I would encourage people to ask also questions if they have any additional comments or feedback to add now. Please feel free to add them on the questions. But just quickly, there was a question on the budgeting and the production of the documentaries. And as Adrian talked, and also Julia, they did confirm that, you know, it takes, we need money for the documentaries to take place. And you need personal investment from professional filmmakers to make sure that the idea is properly delivered to the audience who should benefit from the content that is being delivered. And this is where actually knowledge mobilization comes to take place. Lupin did ask about the series on Aboriginal people in television network. And Heather had a question for Prem, was about if Lua Parker, I'm sorry if I didn't capture if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, was involved in the original workshop. So we have here a lot of questions that are rather specific to certain documentaries, and I see that most of our panelists did answer them. I'll just leave a space right now if any of the participants would like to also feel free, please, to write on the chat if they have any questions for our panelists. I'm just gonna leave a minute or two, or raise your hands. I'm not sure if that option is available to raise the hands.
I'll just raise this hand. Ariel, are you still here? I see Ariel is who I know from the doc community, asked a question about the budgets and where the funding comes from, producing and creating the docs apart from the funding for your research. Also, are there documentary participant co-researchers paid? And if so, can you talk about the amounts and ethics of deciding what to pay them? So very quickly, I'll say that the last application that I made to SSHRC, this is for a new documentary about what happens to our data after we die, because I'm still obsessed about databases. The budget was $350,000, and I was turned down, and I've resubmitted it since. But the really weird thing was one assessor said it's too much money, and the other one said it's not enough money. So it's getting stuff funded through SSHRC is really difficult, because unless you specifically, now I think the only way to do it is to insist that there's somebody who knows something about documentary film on the adjudicating panel, and really the only way you can do that is if you go through the interdis panels. So there's a problem at SSHRC's end, because they say they want to fund these things, but the adjudication panels don't know what a documentary budget looks like. And when you put these budgets together, if you say that I'm going to pay a co-creator, or I'm going to pay, you know, a camera operator, I'm going to pay an editor, I'm going to pay people professional rates, SSHRC will come back and say, or adjudicators will say, well, that's too much money and it's not being spent on graduate students. So it's, as much as we're getting this, it's, getting the message that we should be doing this, there are real institutional barriers to carrying it out in a way that makes sense in terms of production. So then you have to find other sources of money to supplement, or you have to find people who are willing to work for less, or, there are real problems. It sounds like a lovely idea. I'm going to make a doc as a research mobilization project, but there are real institutional barriers to doing it.
Thank you so much, Julia. I think the need for transparency was echoed throughout the questions. And so I do appreciate you for sharing that as your experience, and great tips for those that are interested in making film documentaries. And so on that note, I want to take the time to, thank all of our wonderful panelists today, from Adrian, Prem, Julia, Victoria, Amrit. Thank you for sharing your insights, your experience, and your knowledge with us today. I also want to take the time to thank everyone that showed up to be here and to learn and to share with these conversations. Of course, special thank you to DOCTalks for creating this space. And in fact, if you are interested in watching today's recording of this panel, or you are interested in learning more about knowledge mobilization, we encourage you to visit researchimpact.ca and doctalks.ca. We are dropping the links in the chat so that you can have access to those links directly. And we wish you all a wonderful end to your day and week. So thank you once again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.